"She's old news," Richard Carter said, just loud enough for the table to hear, and just soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant to humiliate her. But everyone heard it anyway, because the music dipped at exactly the wrong moment and the soft clink of glasses paused like the room itself had decided to listen. And Evelyn Carter didn't react, not when a few polite laughs followed, not when someone shifted in their seat pretending it was harmless, not even when the young woman beside Richard lowered her gaze with a small, practiced smile that suggested she had already accepted the role being handed to her. Because Evelyn had learned something over the years, something that didn't come from books or meetings or contracts, but from watching people long enough to understand what they revealed when they thought no one was paying attention. And in that moment she understood more than what had just been said. She understood that this had been planned, rehearsed in tone if not in words, placed carefully into a setting where witnesses would make it real, where silence would seal it, where her absence of reaction would be interpreted as agreement. And so she remained still, her fingers lightly wrapped around the stem of a champagne glass, the condensation cool against her skin, the faint citrus scent from someone's drink nearby mixing with the low hum of conversation returning as if nothing had happened, because that was how these things worked. Not with shouting or scenes, but with small public adjustments of position, a shift in language, a reintroduction of roles, and Richard was good at that. He always had been good at making decisions feel inevitable, good at presenting change as progress, good at ensuring that by the time anyone questioned it, it was already done, and tonight was no different except for one detail he had overlooked, one detail he assumed no longer mattered, because to him Evelyn was part of the past, something that had already been accounted for, something already filed away, and that assumption sat quietly beneath his confidence like a crack he didn't know existed, because while he turned slightly toward the younger woman, explaining something about moving forward and new direction, Evelyn watched, not them exactly but the room, the way certain people avoided her eyes, the way others glanced too quickly, the way a few remained perfectly still, calculating, because rooms like this always had layers, and the ones who said nothing often knew the most. And then, just as the music rose again and the moment threatened to dissolve into something forgettable, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, not dramatically, not enough for everyone to notice, but enough for a few heads to turn, enough for a subtle shift in attention, and a man stepped inside, mid-50s, composed, unhurried, his presence not loud but unmistakable to those who recognized him, and Evelyn did immediately, though her expression didn't change, though her posture remained the same, though to anyone watching she was still the woman who had just been dismissed with a sentence, because she understood something else now, something even more important than what had just been said, that the past doesn't disappear simply because someone decides it's inconvenient. It waits, it aligns, it returns when the timing is no longer in your control. And as the man's gaze moved across the room and settled briefly, precisely on her, Evelyn Carter did what she had done from the beginning. She didn't react, but this time her silence meant something entirely different, because this wasn't the end of her place in that room. It was the first moment anyone had actually begun to see it. The room adjusted before anyone admitted that it had, conversations thinning at the edges, laughter arriving a second too late, as if people were waiting to understand whether they had just witnessed something insignificant or something that would matter later. And Evelyn remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm in a way that was not passive but deliberate, because she had already learned that moments like this did not need to be corrected immediately, they needed to be observed, catalogued, allowed to unfold until everyone revealed where they stood. And across the room Daniel Hayes did not hurry, he did not announce himself, he simply moved forward with the kind of quiet confidence that did not ask for attention but received it anyway. A few executives straightened slightly when they recognized him. One man near the bar set his glass down without taking a sip, another leaned in to whisper a name under his breath. And still Richard did not turn. Still he continued speaking to the younger woman at his side, explaining something about quarterly projections and leadership transitions as if the evening had already resolved itself in his favor, as if the introduction he had just made had finalized a decision no one would question. And Evelyn watched that too, the certainty in his voice, the way he assumed the room would follow, because it usually did, because for years she had helped build that certainty behind the scenes, shaping conversations, smoothing conflicts, making sure the numbers aligned with the narrative he preferred, and now he stood in the center of it without looking back, without considering that the structure he relied on might not be as stable as he believed. And then Daniel reached the edge of their table, not interrupting, not inserting himself, simply standing there for a moment until the shift became impossible to ignore, until someone finally noticed and fell silent mid-sentence, and that silence moved outward, subtle but undeniable, until Richard paused, just briefly, just long enough to follow the direction of everyone else's attention, and when he turned, there was a fraction of a second where his expression did not change because he had not yet placed the face in front of him, and then recognition arrived, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to disrupt the rhythm he had been controlling all evening, and Evelyn saw it, that slight hesitation, that recalibration, and she did nothing. She did not step forward, she did not speak, she allowed the space to remain exactly as it was, because this was no longer about correcting what had been said, it was about letting the consequences of it arrive in their own time, and Daniel inclined his head just slightly, not to Richard, not to the table, but to Evelyn, a gesture so small it could be missed if someone was not paying attention, but impossible to misinterpret if they were. And in that moment the balance in the room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that changed how people were looking, how they were thinking, how they were beginning to reconsider what they had just witnessed, because the story they thought they understood a few minutes ago no longer fit as cleanly as it had, and Richard, still holding on to the last thread of control, forced a polite smile, the kind used when an unexpected variable appears in a meeting, and asked a simple question that sounded routine but carried something sharper underneath, and Evelyn heard it without turning her head, without moving her hands, without giving anything away, because she understood now that this was the moment where silence did the most work, where saying nothing allowed everything else to become visible, and for the first time that evening, the room was no longer watching her as someone being replaced, it was watching her as someone they might have misunderstood all along. Richard let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, the kind people use when they want to regain control of a room without admitting they have lost it, and he straightened slightly, adjusting the cuff of his jacket as if the moment required nothing more than a polite reset. But his eyes stayed on Daniel now, sharper, measuring, trying to place not just the face but the implication behind it, because men like Richard did not worry about who someone was, they worried about what that person could change, and Daniel did not rush to answer. He did not extend a hand, he did not offer an introduction that would make things easy. He simply stood there with a calm that did not match the tension beginning to gather around them, and that contrast alone was enough to draw more attention, enough to make the people closest to the table subtly lean in without appearing to do so, and Evelyn noticed every one of those shifts, the quiet recalculations, the way a woman near the end of the table set her glass down without drinking, the way a senior partner across the room turned his body just slightly to get a clearer view, because rooms like this always responded before they understood, and understanding came later, usually too late for the person who had misread it, and Richard, still holding on to the structure he had built, gestured lightly toward the empty space beside the table as if inviting Daniel into something controlled, something defined, but the gesture did not land. The way it usually did, it did not reestablish authority, it only highlighted that authority was now being questioned, and Daniel's gaze shifted briefly, not to the younger woman, not to anyone else at the table, but back to Evelyn, steady, deliberate, as if confirming something that had already been decided long before this night, and Evelyn did not move, she did not acknowledge it outwardly, but there was a quiet clarity in the way she held herself now, a stillness that was no longer about endurance but about timing, because she understood that whatever was unfolding had not started tonight, it had only been revealed tonight, and that difference mattered because it meant the outcome was already in motion, and Richard felt that too, even if he could not yet define it, a slight tightening in his expression, a fraction of a second where his confidence did not fully return, and he filled that space the only way he knew how, with words, controlled, polished, carefully neutral, asking again who Daniel was, this time with a tone that suggested expectation rather than curiosity. But Daniel did not answer the question directly. Instead he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, slow enough that it did not seem abrupt, deliberate enough that it could not be ignored. And he withdrew a slim folder, nothing dramatic, nothing oversized, just a simple, clean document holder that looked like it belonged in a boardroom rather than a social event. And that alone changed the temperature of the moment, because documents meant structure, they meant decisions, they meant something that existed beyond conversation. And Evelyn saw the exact moment Richard recognized that, the slight pause before he spoke again, the way his attention shifted from Daniel's face to the folder and back again. And for the first time that evening, he did not immediately speak, and that silence, brief as it was, carried more weight than anything that had been said so far, because it was not chosen, it was forced, and Evelyn remained exactly where she was, her hand still resting lightly on the glass, her expression composed, but inside that stillness there was something else now, not reaction, not emotion but recognition, because this was the point where the narrative began to move without Richard's control, where the version of events he had presented a few minutes ago no longer held the same certainty, and as Daniel placed the folder gently on the table without opening it, without explaining it, without even looking at Richard, the message was already clear to anyone paying attention. This was not an interruption, this was a correction, and Evelyn Carter, still silent, understood that the past had not returned to be acknowledged, it had returned to be seen in full. Richard did not touch the folder right away, and that hesitation, small as it was, did more to shift the room than any raised voice could have, because people who had worked with him long enough understood his rhythm, understood that he did not pause unless something forced him to reconsider, and now he was reconsidering, his eyes flicking briefly toward the others at the table as if measuring how much of this moment had already slipped out of his control, and the younger woman beside him adjusted her posture, her earlier confidence softening just slightly, not disappearing but recalibrating, because she could feel it too, the change in tone, the way the attention in the room had moved away from her introduction and settled somewhere else entirely, somewhere she could not yet define, and Evelyn watched all of it without moving because this was the part most people misunderstood. They thought power was in the response, in the immediate correction, in the ability to speak louder, or faster or sharper, but real power was in timing, in knowing when the moment had shifted enough that a single action would carry more weight than a dozen explanations, and she could see that moment approaching now, not yet fully formed but close enough that even those who did not understand the details could feel the pressure building under the surface, and Richard, still trying to regain structure, reached for the folder at last, his fingers brushing against it with a controlled motion that suggested ownership, as if touching it would reduce it to something manageable, something he could process and dismiss. But the moment his hand rested on it, Daniel spoke, not loudly, not with any urgency, just a calm, even tone that cut through the space more effectively than volume ever could, asking him to wait, and that simple request carried an authority that did not need to explain itself, and for a second, just a second, Richard did not move. His hand still on the folder, his expression tightening in a way that was almost imperceptible unless someone knew what to look for, and Evelyn did. She had seen that expression before in boardrooms, in negotiations, in the rare moments when something unexpected entered the equation and he had to decide whether to confront it or contain it, and tonight he chose to contain it, withdrawing his hand slowly, leaning back just enough to suggest patience rather than uncertainty. But the shift had already happened, because now the folder was no longer his to control, it belonged to the moment itself, and Daniel let the silence settle again before continuing, not explaining the contents, not offering a summary, just stating, in a tone that assumed it would be understood, that the document represented decisions that had already been made, not tonight, not recently, but over time, and that tonight was simply when those decisions would become visible, and that sentence, simple as it was, moved through the room in a way that made people reconsider everything they had assumed about the evening, because it suggested that what they were witnessing was not an interruption but a reveal, not a reaction but a sequence reaching its natural conclusion, and Evelyn felt that recognition ripple outward, saw it in the way a few people exchanged glances, in the way someone near the back took a small step closer, in the way the room itself seemed to quiet not out of politeness but out of anticipation, and she remained still, her silence no longer defensive, no longer protective but intentional, because she understood that speaking now would reduce the clarity of what was unfolding, and clarity was exactly what this moment required, and Richard, sensing the shift but not yet fully understanding it, forced another small smile, the kind that tried to reframe uncertainty as control, and asked what exactly was being implied. But this time the question did not carry the same weight. It did not anchor the room the way his words usually did. It simply floated there, waiting, and Daniel did not answer immediately. He let the question sit, let it exist without resolution, because unanswered questions had a way of revealing more than direct statements ever could, and as the seconds stretched just enough to become noticeable, Evelyn Carter understood something with complete certainty. This was no longer about what Richard had said earlier, it was about what he had failed to anticipate, and for the first time that evening the room was no longer waiting for him to define what happened next. Daniel finally moved, not quickly, not in a way that demanded attention, but with a deliberate calm that made people notice anyway, and instead of opening the folder himself, he turned it slightly on the table, just enough that it faced Richard without actually pushing it toward him. A subtle shift that made the document feel less like an object and more like a boundary, and Richard's eyes followed that movement, narrowing just slightly as he tried to maintain the same composed expression he had worn all evening. But the rhythm was gone now, the ease replaced by something tighter, something more controlled, and Evelyn saw that too, the way his shoulders no longer rested as naturally, the way his voice, when he spoke again, carried a fraction more force than necessary, asking what exactly this was supposed to mean. But Daniel did not match that energy. He did not raise his voice. He did not mirror the tension. He simply answered in a tone that suggested the explanation had already been provided elsewhere, that the details were not new, only their timing was, and that sentence alone caused a quiet ripple through the people closest to them because it implied something deeper, something that existed beyond this room, beyond this evening, something that had been moving forward without announcement. And Evelyn remained still, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, because she recognized the pattern now, not just in Richard, but in the room itself. The way attention was no longer fixed on the surface of the conversation but had begun to search beneath it, looking for context, for alignment, for the missing piece that would make sense of what they were witnessing, and that search always led somewhere, always revealed more than intended, and Richard, sensing that shift, reached again for control, this time not by touching the folder but by addressing the room, offering a brief explanation about ongoing transitions, about restructuring, about decisions that had been under discussion for some time, his words smooth, practiced, almost convincing if someone had not been paying close attention. But the problem with explanations like that was not in what they said, it was in what they avoided, and Daniel did not interrupt him. He allowed the explanation to exist fully, to settle into the air, to give the room something to compare against. And only when Richard finished did Daniel speak again, quietly, precisely, clarifying not the details but the timeline, and that distinction mattered, because timelines could not be softened the way language could. Timelines showed sequence, intent, direction, and as he spoke, a few heads turned again, this time not toward him but toward Evelyn, because suddenly her presence in the room carried a different weight, not as someone being replaced, but as someone who had been positioned at the center of something much larger than anyone had realized. And Evelyn did not acknowledge those looks, she did not shift, she did not respond, because this was not the moment for her to define anything. This was the moment for others to begin questioning what they thought they understood, and that questioning had already started, visible in the subtle changes in posture, in the way conversations around the edges of the room had faded completely, in the way even the staff moving between tables slowed just enough to take in what was happening, and Richard, now fully aware that the room was no longer anchored to him, let out a controlled breath, his expression settling into something more serious, less performative, and he asked one more time directly now what exactly was in the folder, and Daniel looked at him for a moment, not with challenge, not with hostility, but with a calm certainty that did not need either, and said that it contained decisions that had already been signed, already been approved, already been set into motion, and that tonight was simply the first time Richard was seeing them all together. And that was the moment Evelyn felt it shift completely, not just in the room, not just in Richard, but in the narrative itself, because whatever had been implied before was now undeniable. This was not a possibility, not a threat, not a negotiation, it was something already done. And as the silence that followed settled deeper than any before it, Evelyn Carter understood that the past had not returned to ask for recognition, it had returned with proof. Richard did not reach for the folder this time, and that absence of movement carried more weight than any reaction could have, because the room had already shifted into a space where restraint was more revealing than action, and Evelyn could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of what had been said, what had not been said, and what could still be controlled, but control was no longer something he could assume. It was something he had to regain, and that difference changed everything, and across from him Daniel remained steady, not pressing forward, not escalating, simply allowing the silence to expand just enough that it became uncomfortable for anyone trying to ignore it, and that discomfort spread quietly, not in obvious ways, but in small telling details, a glass set down without being finished, a chair adjusted without reason, a conversation at the far end of the room that stopped mid-sentence and did not resume, and Evelyn stood within that stillness, not separate from it, but at its center, because whether anyone had acknowledged it yet or not, the axis of the room had moved, and it had moved toward her, and she understood why, not because of anything she had said, but because of everything she had not, because silence, when held long enough, forced other people to fill it, and what they filled it with revealed far more than they intended. And now the room was filling that silence with questions, quiet, unspoken. Questions about timelines, about authority, about who had actually been making decisions and when, and Richard felt those questions even if he could not hear them, because the certainty he had relied on earlier no longer held, and when he finally spoke again his voice was controlled but tighter now, asking Daniel to be clear, asking him to explain exactly what had been approved, but Daniel did not shift his tone, did not respond with detail. Instead he clarified something simpler, something more precise, that the approvals were not recent, that they had been processed over weeks, documented, reviewed, and finalized through channels that did not require Richard's direct involvement, and that statement, more than anything else, caused a visible change, not dramatic, not loud but undeniable, because it suggested that the structure Richard believed he controlled had already adapted without him, and Evelyn saw the exact moment that realization reached him. A fraction of a second where his posture changed, where the confidence that had framed his earlier words no longer fit the situation in front of him, and he adjusted. Of course he did, because that was what he did best. He adjusted, he reframed, he searched for a version of events that would return him to the center. But the room was no longer aligned with him in the same way. It was watching, waiting, comparing, and that comparison did not favor certainty, it favored clarity, and clarity was no longer coming from him. And Evelyn remained exactly as she was, her hand still resting lightly against the glass, her expression composed, but inside that stillness there was a quiet recognition, not of victory, not yet, but of direction, because this was the point where the narrative could no longer be redirected, where the sequence that had been set in motion outside this room had entered it fully, and would now unfold regardless of how anyone tried to contain it. And Daniel, sensing that the shift had settled, finally placed one hand lightly on the edge of the folder, not opening it, not presenting it, just anchoring it in place as if to confirm that it belonged here now, that it was part of this moment whether anyone was ready for it or not. And Richard, watching that small gesture, understood something he had not expected to understand tonight, that this was not a discussion he could lead. It was a reality he had to respond to. And as the silence settled once more, deeper, heavier, more defined than before, Evelyn Carter did not move, because she knew this was the moment right before everything became visible, and once it did, there would be no way to return to what had been said earlier, no way to pretend that the past had stayed where it was supposed to be. For a moment no one spoke, not because they were waiting for permission, but because the room had reached a point where speaking too soon would reveal more than intended, and Daniel seemed to understand that better than anyone, because he did not rush to fill the silence. He simply opened the folder, slow, deliberate, placing it flat on the table with a quiet precision that drew every nearby eye without needing to call for attention, and the soft sound of paper shifting carried further than it should have, as if the room itself had lowered its volume to make space for it. And Richard's gaze dropped despite himself, just for a second, just long enough to see the top page, and that was enough, because recognition does not always require reading. Sometimes it only needs a shape, a heading, a signature in the corner that should not be there. And Evelyn watched that exact moment happen, the instant where certainty gave way to something else, something sharper, something closer to understanding, and Richard straightened slightly, too quickly, as if correcting his own reaction before anyone could notice. But people had noticed, not the document itself, not yet, but the change in him, and that was enough to shift their attention further, to pull them closer without movement. And Daniel did not explain the contents, he did not summarize or interpret, he simply turned one page, then another, each movement measured, controlled, allowing the sequence to exist without commentary, because documents like these did not need explanation, they needed context, and context was already forming in the room, piece by piece, in the way people were beginning to connect what they were seeing with what they had assumed earlier. And Evelyn remained still, her silence now unmistakably intentional, because she could feel it as clearly as anyone, the moment where the story had crossed from suggestion into proof. And proof did not require defense, it required acknowledgement, and Richard, realizing that the room was no longer anchored to his version of events, finally leaned forward again, this time not to reclaim authority, but to understand what had already moved beyond him. His voice lower now, more controlled, asking what exactly these documents represented. But Daniel did not answer directly. Instead he glanced briefly at Evelyn, not seeking approval, not asking permission, but recognizing alignment. And then he said something simple, something that carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have, that everything in the folder had been built on work that had started long before tonight, long before the restructuring, long before the introductions that had just taken place, and that the names on those documents reflected that history, not the narrative that had been presented a few minutes ago. And that was when the room shifted again, more visibly this time, because people understood history, they understood contribution, they understood the difference between what was said publicly and what had actually been done behind the scenes, and their attention moved not toward Richard, not toward the younger woman, but toward Evelyn, and she felt it without turning her head, without changing her posture, because she had expected this moment, not the exact form of it, not the exact timing, but the inevitability of it, the point where silence would no longer be interpreted as absence but as restraint. And Richard saw it too, saw the way the room was recalibrating, the way the assumptions that had supported him minutes ago were no longer holding, and for the first time that evening, he did not try to redirect it immediately. He hesitated, just long enough for that hesitation to become visible, and Daniel, sensing that the shift had settled, closed the folder again, not with finality but with quiet certainty, as if to say that nothing more needed to be shown, because what mattered had already been understood. And as that realization settled across the table, across the room, across every person who had witnessed the exchange, Evelyn Carter remained exactly where she was, because she knew this was not the end of the reveal. It was only the moment where everyone finally understood that they had been watching the wrong version of the story all along. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt structured, as if something invisible had settled into place and everyone in the room was adjusting to it without fully understanding how or why. And Evelyn could see it clearly now in the way people held themselves, the way their attention no longer drifted but stayed fixed, anchored to a reality that had just been revealed in fragments but was already reshaping the entire context of the evening. And Richard remained seated for a second longer than necessary, his posture composed but no longer effortless, because effort had entered the equation now, calculation had replaced certainty, and when he finally stood, it was not to reclaim the moment, it was to regain footing within it, and that difference was subtle but unmistakable, and he reached for the folder again, this time without hesitation, not because he felt in control, but because he needed to understand what had already been set into motion without him. And as he opened it, carefully, deliberately, the movement drew the room in tighter, not physically but in focus, because this was no longer speculation, it was confirmation. And Evelyn did not look down at the pages, she did not need to, because she already knew what they contained, not every detail, not every line, but the structure, the intention, the direction, because she had been part of that structure long before it became visible. And that was the part no one in the room fully understood yet. Not even Richard, who now scanned the first page with a controlled expression that was beginning to crack at the edges, not dramatically, not enough for someone unfamiliar with him to notice, but enough for Evelyn to recognize, because she had seen that exact shift before, in moments where outcomes did not align with expectations, and it was always followed by one of two things, either an attempt to reframe the situation or a decision to confront it directly. And for a brief second it seemed like he might choose the first, his eyes lifting slightly as if preparing to speak, to redirect, to reinterpret what he was seeing into something that still fit the narrative he had presented earlier. But the second page stopped him, not with shock, not with anything dramatic, but with a kind of quiet finality that removed the possibility of reinterpretation, and his hand paused just slightly longer than before, his fingers resting against the paper as if confirming that it was real. And that was when the room understood, not the details, not the specifics, but the shift, the undeniable movement from assumption to fact. And that understanding spread in a way that did not need words, in the way a senior executive near the back straightened completely, in the way the younger woman beside Richard no longer held the same composed confidence but instead watched him carefully, as if trying to read something she had not anticipated needing to read. And Evelyn remained exactly where she was, her stillness now unmistakably central to everything that was unfolding, because the room had begun to align around a different axis, not the one that had been introduced earlier, not the one that had been presented with confidence and ease, but one that had existed quietly beneath it all along. And Daniel did not interrupt, he did not guide the reaction, he simply allowed it to happen, because there was nothing left to prove, only something to recognize. And Richard, closing the folder slowly this time, did not look immediately at Daniel, he did not address the room, he looked at Evelyn directly, for the first time since the moment he had dismissed her, and that look carried something new, not apology, not even acknowledgement, but awareness, the beginning of an understanding that the position he had assigned her no longer matched reality. And Evelyn met That look without changing her expression, without offering anything in return, because this was not the moment for resolution. It was the moment where perception shifted permanently, where the labels that had been applied minutes ago no longer held, and the room felt that too, the way attention settled fully on her now, not out of curiosity but out of recognition, because people were beginning to see the pattern, the timeline, the alignment between what had been revealed and what had been assumed, and that alignment pointed in one direction, one that could not be easily undone or ignored, and Richard, still standing, finally spoke again. But this time his voice did not carry the same authority. It carried something measured, something cautious, asking a question that no longer sought control but clarity, and Daniel answered simply, without emphasis, without explanation, confirming that everything in that folder had been structured with Evelyn at its center, not as a supporting figure, not as a past contributor, but as the one who held the position that had just been reassigned in front of everyone. And that was the moment the shift completed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that settled across the room like something undeniable, because it reframed everything that had just happened, every word, every introduction, every assumption, and Evelyn Carter, still calm, still silent, understood that the story had finally reached the point where it could no longer be told the way it had begun. No one laughed this time, no one reached for a glass or shifted in their seat to soften the moment, because the room had moved past politeness and into something far more precise, a collective awareness that what had just unfolded could not be undone with tone or timing or explanation, and Evelyn stood in the center of that awareness without claiming it, without reacting to it, because she understood that recognition was most powerful when it arrived on its own, unprompted, undeniable, and Richard remained still for a second longer, the folder now closed in his hand, no longer something he could dismiss or reinterpret, but something he had to accept, and when he finally set it back down on the table, the motion was controlled but different from before, not ownership, not dismissal but placement, as if acknowledging that it no longer belonged to him, and his eyes returned to Evelyn again, more steadily this time, because avoidance was no longer an option, and in that look there was something that had not been there earlier, not regret, not apology but recognition, the beginning of an understanding that the position he had tried to define for her had never actually been his to assign, and Evelyn met that look without offering anything back, not approval, not rejection, just presence, because this was not a conversation she needed to win. It was a reality that had already revealed itself, and around them the room adjusted fully, not in noise, not in movement but in alignment, the kind of shift that happens when everyone silently agrees that the structure they thought they were observing was not the real one. And Daniel, who had said very little, stepped back slightly, not withdrawing, but removing himself from the center now that the center had become clear on its own, because his role had never been to lead the moment, only to introduce what had been hidden long enough. And the younger woman beside Richard no longer spoke, no longer smiled, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful stillness as she recalculated her place in a situation she no longer fully understood. And Evelyn noticed that too. Not with satisfaction, not with judgment but with clarity, because this was never about individuals, it was about structure, about who held it, who understood it, and who had mistaken visibility for control. And Richard finally spoke again, but this time there was no performance in his voice, no attempt to shape the room, only a direct question, quiet, measured, asking why he had not been informed, and the answer when it came did not come from Daniel, it came from the space itself, from the weight of everything that had just been revealed, because the reason was already evident, because decisions built over time did not require announcement when they reached completion, they required acknowledgement, and Evelyn did not say that out loud. She did not need to, because the room had already arrived at it, piece by piece, and that was when she finally moved, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but simply placing her glass down on the table with a soft, controlled motion, the faint sound marking a transition that everyone felt even if they could not explain it. And she looked at Richard directly, calmly, her expression unchanged but her presence now unmistakably different, no longer positioned by someone else's words, but defined by everything that had just been revealed. And when she spoke, her voice was even, quiet, not raised to command attention because it did not need to, and she said that nothing had been hidden, only overlooked, and that what had been built did not disappear simply because someone chose not to see it. And that sentence settled into the room with a clarity that no explanation could match, because it reframed the entire evening, not as a confrontation, not as a reversal, but as a correction that had been waiting for its moment. And Richard did not interrupt. He did not argue because there was nothing left to argue against, only something to understand, and as that understanding took hold, visible in the stillness of the room, in the way attention remained fixed not out of curiosity but out of recognition, Evelyn Carter stood exactly as she had from the beginning, calm, composed, and completely in control of a narrative she had never needed to announce, because in the end, it had revealed itself without her having to chase it, and that was the part no one in the room would forget. Not the words, not the folder, not even the moment of silence, but the realization that the person they had just watched be dismissed had never actually left her position at all.